Setting up your meeting for Facebook Live.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
And we are a go. You can start, Trudes.
Good evening, bonsoir, and shalom to all of you who are tuned in for yet another virtual literary salon of the Jewish Public Library. We are so happy that we can get together for a fascinating evening. I thank now already Roxana and Maria for having tuned us in. And today's open book will be presented by Sherry Simon, one of our own Canadian leading theorists in translation theory and history. Sherry Simon writes about language and memory in cities from Montreal to Barcelona, Trieste, Calcutta, Chernovich, etc. And she speaks many languages in order to be able to do all these. And after her prize-winning Translating Montreal, published in 2006, and Cities in Translation, published in 2012, she has published Translation Sites, a field guide, an exploration of places shaped by languages. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a member of the Académie des Lettres du Québec, and she teaches in the French department at Concordia University. She writes about Hotel in Sarajevo, an opera house in Prague, a memorial in Lviv, a bridge in Mostar, a garden in Ireland, a market in Hong Kong, a church in Toledo, and these are stops on an unusual itinerary. Each place tells stories of languages in conflict. Languages are a powerful vehicle of memory, and when they have been eliminated or suppressed, words from the past have particular resonance. In her talk, Sherry will introduce some of these places and their histories, lingering in one special translated site in Central Europe where Jewish memory is revived through language. Join us as Sherry reads and discusses her book, Translation Sites, a Field Guide. And welcome. I'm looking very much forward. I'm sure all of us will. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Trudis for the introduction. I'd like to thank Shelley Pomerantz of Blue Metropolis, who helped to organize this, as well as Roxana Browns and her committee and these virtual salons. I'm also very pleased to have the chance to say something about the Jewish Public Library and how much it means to me. I've been a member of the library since I was a child, when it was in the Y building across the street. And I've always been proud of this multilingual pillar of the Montreal Jewish community. The Jewish Public Library for me is the true heart of Jewish culture in Montreal. So important for expressing and fostering through literature our sense of who we are. So thank you to the library. And let me start with a story. When I was 13 or 14, growing up in Montreal, I invented a game for myself. On Saturdays, when there was nothing much to do at home, I'd hop on a bus and then keep transferring until I found myself in some strange part of the city. I lived in the West End in Snowdon, so the logical direction to head was east. I was trying to get lost. The fun was to discover a totally alien place surrounded by a language I did not understand. I enjoyed the mystery of it, the sense of possibility. Any kid in any city can play this game, but in Montreal it had special dramatic potential because Montreal was a city divided not only by social class, but by language. To cross the city was to enter a different soundscape and to take in the special accents of history and class. I kept these excursions secret. I'm not sure what I told my parents, but I managed to disappear for most of the day, wander distant neighborhoods, and come home without reporting any of this. But going off without their permission wasn't the only rule I was breaking. I also sensed that my very presence in these neighborhoods was a kind of transgression, that I was an intruder into communities that weren't mine. The Montreal of my childhood was an intensely parochial place. To venture out of one's home bubble of language and religion was risky. Not physically risky, one felt perfectly safe. No, it was more of an existential kind of risk. The writer Mavis Gallant compared these, writer Mavis Gallant compared these bubbles to mossy little ponds, noting that most people simply floated in such ponds labeled French and Catholic or English and Protestant, never wondering what it might be like to step ashore. Jewish and English was also a pond. It was comfortable and secure for sure, but to me the shore was tempting. In writing my latest book, I've been reminded of my adolescent adventures. I realized that I'd been playing some version of my childhood game for most of my life, seeking out places, neighborhoods, cities where I could experience the disorientation of language. Not for the same reasons, not for the pleasure of doing something I wasn't supposed to do, but in particular to experience the music of competing languages. The shock of difference I experienced as a child has turned into an attitude of inquiry. How is it that certain places are singularly affecting, and that language can be the central stimulus in this experience? How do languages shape our ideas about how different humans are, one from the other? I began to investigate places where languages speak to each other across gulfs of time. I had my fetishes, my fetish cities, the Italian city of Trieste, with its blend of Italian and Slovenian against the German past. Barcelona, with the conversation between Spanish and Catalan. Indian cities like Calcutta, today known as Kolkata, with their tremendous language diversity and turbulent histories. And of course, Montreal. But in my travels, real, but also in books and movies, I've come across many other polyglot places or translation sites. For instance, in my guidebook, there are stops, as Trude said, at a German opera house in Prague, a Japanese garden in Ireland, a synagogue given the Christian name Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo, and a polyglot urban market in Hong Kong. At the heart of each site is an unresolved exchange. Like translations that display the double realities of which they are composed, polyglot places offer, in Anne Carson's words, two tracks of reality running at the same time. Montreal has many such sites. I'm sure you can think of some. Places whose histories are a movement through and across languages, like the Monument National, for instance, on Saint-Laurent, that once housed both French-speaking theater troupes and the Yiddish theater troupe of Montreal. One of my favorite places, St. Michael the Archangel Church on Saint-Viateur, which has been successively Irish, Polish, Italian, and English. Or Mount Royal, which tells stories in many tongues, from the days of the First Nations to today's Arabic or Bengali. Now I'm going to give two examples from my book, two sites among the 18 stops in my guidebook. The first will be a bridge. The second, a monument in Lviv. So Maria, if you could show the bridge, I'd like to talk about the bridge of Mostar.
Just a second.
Okay, I'll keep talking, and then when it shows, it shows.
There it is, yeah.
It will show. So consider the bridge of Mostar, a magnificent Turkish construction dating from the 17th century. Destroyed in 1993 during the Bosnian War and rebuilt in 2005 with the aid of the European Union. Patching up the bridge and restoring it was a tremendously important symbolic event. But the situation in Bosnia was not repaired, and it remains fragile to this day. If you walk on the bridge, among the many languages you will hear, you'll hear a language called Bosnian. This is a language that didn't exist 30 years ago. It came into being during the 1990s as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia. Yeah, have you got it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a language that did not exist, and it came into being only in the 1990s as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia, and was officially recognized along with Croatian and Serbian in 1994. Where once the former Yugoslav languages were considered mutually intelligible and the minor differences between them downplayed, now the typically Bosnian expressions, usually of Turkish origin, were emphasized. And so translation has become necessary. The bridge of translation has become an obstacle path, more difficult than ever to cross. But now another bridge, this time the Øresund Bridge that connects Denmark and Sweden. Chosen as the symbol and backdrop for a long-running and wildly successful television series, The Bridge, it enables the speedy passage of traffic. It also gave birth to a new language, a mixture of Danish and Swedish, delivered to television audiences in the episode of the Scandinavian crime television series. The plot, which has inspired remakes around the world, features crimes investigated by cops from both sides of the border who become reluctant partners. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this series called The Bridge, which was actually inspired, I think, by Bon Cop, Bad Cop, which was our own production. So in the Danish-Swedish series, the characters each speak their own language, behaving as if they can understand each other with no problem, while a more realistic rendering would reveal at least some misunderstandings. They act as if language difference were of no consequence, as if the Tower of Babel never existed, as if we can all understand each other no matter how arcane the message. In the subtitles read by English-speaking audiences, there's no indication of these two different languages. So this is quite the contrary of what we saw on the Mostar Bridge, where the small differences between languages were made more pronounced. While the Mostar Bridge stands as a reminder of the difficulties that block passages, the Øresund Bridge suggests the possibility of slick, frictionless surfaces, quick and effortless communication. So the bridge is a place where languages meet, but the kinds of conversations they can have are different. You might think that the closer the languages are linguistically, the easier it would be. So on the Mostar Bridge, the Bosnian is very, very similar to the other languages, but it's made to seem more different. Languages that look like each other, that sound like each other, are sometimes harder to translate than languages that come from opposite ends of the planet. Why is that? In fact, the answer has nothing to do with linguistics. It has everything to do with history. Not surprisingly, conflict increases the space between languages, sharpens idea of difference, calls for translations, while the pressure of globalization diminishes distance, invites attitudes of indifference. These relationships affect how we think about difference in very broad terms. Are cultural realities becoming more different from one another, or rather blending into some kind of globalized whole? When is difference exciting? And when does it begin to seem overwhelming, opaque, or dangerous? We usually think of the opposite of difference as sameness, a reassuring kind of human sameness. But the opposite of difference can be indifference, a kind of apathy, lack of interest in other realities, sometimes the incapacity to feel empathy or to engage with others. These may sound like existential or philosophical questions, but they're also translation questions. And they bring me back to my childhood travels across Montreal. My experiences turned me into a translator, someone constantly measuring differences between language, sometimes fascinated with what seemed like differences so huge and solid they can't possibly be reconciled, sometimes exchanging words as casually as if they were small change. And someone turning this same kind of relentless attention to places, places I call translation sites or polyglot places. So now I'm going to go to another such site. After looking at the bridge, I'll introduce you to someone who may look familiar to you because he actually was recently, a year or two ago, at the Jewish Public Library, Philippe Sands, who gave a wonderful, wonderful talk. So I'm going to take you to another site, this one in today's Ukraine. The linguistic landscape of Eastern Europe was very important for my book because it's shaped by a century of conflict and shifting political and language regimes. In Eastern Europe, the wounds of history are still legible. Languages are vehicles of memory. I'm going to discuss a Holocaust monument in the city of Lviv called the Space of Synagogues. What makes this site particularly affecting for me was precisely the way it used language to give substance to the lived experience of the victims of the Holocaust. So in what follows, I'll be mentioning a few names. Philippe Sands, a British lawyer who spoke last year at the Jewish Public Library, author of a powerful book called East-West Street. I'll mention Joseph Witlin, an exile from Lviv who in 1946 published in Polish a memoir of the city, and a third named Deborah Vogel, a Jewish poet who unusually for a woman earned a PhD in Polish literature during the 1930s and then turned to writing modernist poetry in Yiddish. So off we go. This, the image that you just saw, the previous one, Maria, that is a storefront in contemporary Lviv, which used to be called Lemberg. And what you see on the storefront are words in German, Polish, and Yiddish, recalling a time when those were languages that were everyday languages in that city, and which today you no longer hear. What's interesting is that in the windows in the middle there, you actually see that it's no longer a store selling butter or buttermilk, but it's actually a photocopy shop. And in Russian, in Ukrainian, it says shtampa in the inner windows. So it's a very interesting image of contemporary Lviv. Okay, so off we go. A traveler to Lviv transiting through Munich airport might react with astonishment to a sign announcing the flight. The sign says Lemberg, a Habsburg name by which this city was known until the fall of the empire in 1918. Flying there today is like catching a plane for Constantinople. The author and legal expert Philippe Sands took this flight to Lviv in 2017. He was there to launch the translation of his book, East-West Street, a remarkable detective-like investigation that reaches back into the imperial history of the city. It tells the story of the intertwined lives of three Jewish men: his grandfather, Leon, Hersch Lauterpacht, the inventor of the term crimes against humanity, and Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide. All three were born in interwar Lviv, then a Polish city. Sands was adept at conveying his passion for the city, but he was especially effective in communicating his enthusiasm to young people. Because of the circumstances of history, he told them, you may not know of the extraordinary men who were born here, or some of the contributions your city has made to modern history. But with his lectures and his book, Sands was trying to correct this neglect. What he was saying to them was, your city has experienced remarkable events. The memory of these happenings, the bad and the good, also belong to you. The translation of his book was not only a report on what he had discovered, but an invitation to his Ukrainian readers to make the story theirs. The import of such an invitation is especially meaningful in a city like Lviv. So today's Lviv, which is the Ukrainian name, was once called Leopolis in Italian, Lemberg in German and Yiddish, Lviv in Polish, Lvov in Russian. The name of the street that the Grand Opera sits on was once called Untere Karl-Ludwig-Straße. It became Opernstraße, Adolf Hitler Ring, Prospect Lenina, today Prospect Svobody. Lviv's Jews, once 1/3 of the city's pre-war World War II population, was one of the largest populations, Jewish populations in Poland. This population was obliterated by the Nazis. The Polish residents of the city disappeared too after the war, forcibly resettled in Poland after Lviv became Soviet territory. Lviv today is a Ukrainian city, but its Ukrainian population was a minority until 1945. The new citizens of Lviv had little connection with the historical fabric of the city and its memories. Traveling through Eastern Europe in the late 1990s, the historian Anne Applebaum remarked that the people she saw on the streets of Lviv did not seem to fit the city they were a part of. There was a disconnect between the look of the population and the grand city they inhabited. Exactly what clues triggered these observations is not clear, but whatever her reasons for making the observation, she underlines an important truth. Like many other Eastern European cities, such as Vilnius, which only became Lithuanian at the end of the war, Lviv now has a population of citizens whose urban roots are very shallow. Their knowledge of the city and its past is inevitably partial. That's why I was mentioning that Philippe Sands, when he spoke to the young people of Lviv, said, maybe you don't know about these events that I'm telling you about, but my book will help you make them part of your history. Languages of the past begun to resound again in the city through tourists. So Polish tourists visit the iconic restaurants, palaces, and museums that celebrate pre-war version of the city. German language tourists visit Habsburg sites. Jewish citizens, tourists have begun to return to the city in search of a tragic past. And ghost signs, remnants of old languages, sometimes surface under the crumbling facade of a former shop. There is a renewed mixing of languages then, but a confusion over which ones count, which ones are insider tongues, which ones are considered mere observers. The poet Irina Starovoit worries that explanations of the Holocaust can be perceived as words from the outside, not testimonies that issue from the inside spaces of the neighborhoods and buildings that belong to today's Lviv. The story of the past, the Jewish history of Lviv, she argues, is not a distant foreign reality, but a product of the living city, its streets and buildings. So when languages have been eliminated or suppressed, as I've mentioned, happened in Lviv, restoring them to a public presence becomes all the more powerful. But these translations must be embedded in a collective desire. So I'm going to talk about the Space of Synagogues in Lviv which is such an attempt to reinscribe the Jewish presence and its language into the city. What makes this memorial particularly effective are two things. The monument was the first instance in Ukraine where commemoration of a Jewish historical site was initiated not just by the international Jewish community, but by the city administration in cooperation with various community groups as a site of shared civic responsibility. Second, the use of the many languages of Jewish experience before, during, and after the war. And it's a remarkable way of bringing Jewish experience to life, giving voice to that experience and showing how that voice has been obliged to travel and take up home in other tongues. So now you see some of the images of what is the Space of Synagogues. These stones, I'm now looking at the image with you, have writing on them, and some of the stones have actually images printed on them. So this project called the Space of Synagogues, and Maria, maybe you could just scroll through them because you can, this will give you different views of them. So the project called the Space of Synagogues opened officially in 2016 in the old Jewish section of the old city next to the main square. The space encloses traces of 3 synagogues, all 3 of which were destroyed during the Second World War. During Soviet times, this area was simply abandoned by the Soviets. Unusually, rather than destroying it, they simply left it derelict. So the space was maintained, which is useful. And so the project to restore this zone was a significant new development in the city's history. The monument was artfully designed as a minimalist garden, carrying traces of the past and yet leaving empty spaces where absence can be strongly felt. At the center of this space is a row of 39 stone tablets, which, as you can well see, resemble tombstones. Some stones are imprinted with grainy images of shops and houses from pre-war Lviv. Others are engraved with quotations from former residents about their lives in Lviv, their experiences before, during, or after the Holocaust. The 16 quotes take visitors on a physical journey as they walk among the stones, an emotional journey as they absorb the dramas of history as told by its witnesses. In order to see the images and read the text, visitors are required to bend down, to move between the stones, to make an effort to enter into these testimonies. Each quotation is given in its original language, and that original language could be German, Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Dutch, or French. And each of those quotations is supplemented by English, Hebrew, and Ukrainian translations. These fragments of language evoke both ordinary and extraordinary events. They recall daily life in Lviv before the war, when its many populations shared the spaces of sidewalks and cafes, as they evoke the events of the war and the Holocaust. Each layer of translation carries additional kinds of information, takes the information to a new place. So very briefly, I'll give 2 examples. One is a Yiddish language poem by Israel Ashendorf, not so much a direct memory of events as an imagined return to a home which has been taken over by strangers. What more disquieting feeling than to imagine your own house and find it occupied by people with whom you have no links and who sleep in your bed and cook in your kitchen. The house that Ashendorf's dreamer returns to has foreign food on the table, has an icon hanging on the wall. I quote from the English translation of a poem that was originally written in Yiddish. The house will probably be the same. I will push the door. Neighbors will come by, but of my relatives, none. I will see the old furniture used by new people. In the bed will sleep strangers, foreign food on the table. When I will approach the window, I will see a vase. On the wall will be hanging a silent icon. So this imagined memory evokes the situation of all those whose homes and possessions have been stolen from them and who have been barred from their past by the imposition of new histories. The poem dramatizes a double injustice. The physical space has been taken away, but also the right to memorialize. What comes of the memories of those who are no longer present to claim the territory? How does a city house the memory of a people who are no longer at home there? The Space of Synagogues attempts to enlarge the community of those who are the holders of memory. And then briefly, a poem fragment by Deborah Vogel. So maybe we could see the image, thank you, of Deborah Vogel. Vogel was a Yiddish modernist poet. She was close to Bruno Schulz and conducted an intense literary correspondence with her. She was murdered with her husband and son in the Lviv ghetto in 1942. The following words engraved on yet another stone were taken from a text she wrote in the 1930s. The streets are like the sea. They reflect the color of longing and the difficulty of waiting. The quote is in Yiddish, the language which became Vogel's literary language, but which she learned only as an adult. Yiddish was not Vogel's native tongue. She came from a Polish-speaking Jewish family, and unusually for a Jew and for a woman during that period, she earned a PhD in Polish literature. But then she became active in Yiddish modernist circles, learned the language, and went on to publish both poetry and prose in Yiddish. Vogel is only now being translated into Yiddish, her work recently discovered by young readers able to read Yiddish, translated into English, sorry. And Anastasia Lyubas is one of these readers, a Ukrainian who learned Yiddish, non-Jewish Ukrainian who has learned Yiddish and was published English language versions of the poems. So in 2015, a first translation of Vogel's work was also translated into Ukrainian. So the spiral of translation continues to grow, taking the words of the past into ever new places. So now I'll conclude. Memory, writes Eva Hoffman, is a moral force for Eastern European writers who have long struggled with falsifications of the past. As a vehicle of memory, language also carries a moral force, the possibility of restoring realities that have been effaced. What is particularly moving is when languages are restored to their places in the city, when they're inscribed on stones, when they appear on sidewalks, on plaques, or as in my final quote, on the wooden slats of park benches. Joseph Witlin was a novelist and translator who lived much of his life in Lviv before ending his life in the United States in exile. He wrote a memoir called My Lviv, which is an account full of charm, wit, and nostalgia, written with a distinctive irony of the East European writer. In his portrait of his city, when it was Polish, Witlin remembers the park benches of Lviv, asking what will happen to all the messages etched into them. He says, the park bench, and I quote, is blackened with age and rain, coarse and cracked like the bark of medieval olive trees. Generations of penknives have etched girlfriends' names on you. Where are you today? Who and in what language is now carving their lovers' initials on you? This park bench is a kind of memorial to his past, leaving room also for the languages of the future. Like the Space of Synagogues, it writes languages onto the surfaces of the city with love and tenderness and hope. Thank you.
Well, we are back. And first of all, thank you for this insight and the guide, really, because when I read the title, Translation Sites, a Field Guide, I was wondering about these traveling salesmen with suitcases wanting to follow a project, which some of us have done, who have lived in different worlds, have come over from Germany and other countries to Canada to explore this part of the planet. And thinking about the difficulty, because it's not just how does one teach that? I mean, it's not just the connection of the place you grow up in, or you visit, or you move to, or you choose to, as what we call in German Wahlheimat, a chosen home, moving away from home, and yet for the rest of your life comparing that chosen home with the real home, and the desire to go back and never find it the same, and becoming from an insider to an outsider. And then I was thinking about translation, because you are also a specialist in comparative literature. So we live in literature, and our homes, when we do move away or choose a different home, the home we left, the home is still the language. It's the language you have grown up in, you have left, you reconnect to, you compare to the new language all the time. And now you work with students who have to learn to transcribe, to translate. And you have given quite a number of samples where new languages originate because of political change, where languages disappear. And the last samples you spoke about, especially the Yiddish language in particular, which was wiped out. If I think even of my own home, Cologne, and the places where there are only plaques, where there are only, well, there is the mikveh. There are places you can go to and look down and stare into, and nobody speaks to you. There, you knew also that as a student in 1959 in the University of Cologne, I never had met a Jew until I started to study in the field of literature and visit the library, the Judaica library, and then find myself here in the library. So for me, the question was right away, you as a professor in theory of translation, how can you combine for students whom you teach with the love of what you are doing about memory, urban geography, architecture, history, language history, in order to transmit this sense to them of what is happening when they do translate? How do you do that? What do they have to study? Except for your own search constantly to find the right words for the sites you discovered from youth on. How do you do that? It's just a practical question as a teacher.
Well, that was a very interesting. I thank you. Thank you for your kind words and responding to what I was speaking about. These questions of memory and history and urban geography, and the experiences that you accumulate through your own life. And that's why I always come back to the story of my childhood and how Montreal is such a formative place for me, where I encountered this idea of difference. When I was a child, difference was a wall. It was something very solid there was such a sense of complete otherness between my world, my insulated world of in my community where we were quite self-sufficient, and then this other world which was not that far away. You just needed to take a bus to get there. A very simple thing, and yet it seemed so alien and so very different. And the city continues to contain those kinds of very huge differences. You can have as your neighbor people who, you know, live right next door to you, people whose stories, whose histories are so different. Increasingly, our cities are that way, where migration is increased and the nature of migration is different. The differences are multiplying. And you would think that as differences multiply, maybe they would become more banal. The more different kinds of people, the more different kinds of languages that you would get used to it. And yet some differences remain extremely intense and other differences diminish. So why is that? And I think the answer is you know, is relatively obvious in the sense that differences are not by nature things that keep us apart. What keeps us apart are the way those differences are politicized and turned into conflict. And, but, you know, by the same token, languages are not naturally different one from each other. That is to say, more different. They're all different. All languages are different one from each other. But I remember a shock when I visited Barcelona, and you see the Catalan language, and it looks so much like Spanish. And your first reaction is, why are they making such a fuss? These languages are practically the same. And yet we know that the differences between those two languages, Catalan and Spanish, between the Catalan people who are fighting for their independence, very much in a story that is similar to Quebec. Their language is a different language because it has such a long history. It comes from medieval times. And even if the two words may look the same, they belong to two different histories. So that idea of negotiating, that's what I teach my students, is looking at how do you measure differences between languages? How do you arrive at equivalence? How do you understand what is, when difference is something that you should highlight, and when it's, okay, just that word will be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so much, I mean, just thinking again of this memory issue of what a language may have meant, or what a language which is not known or not spoken. I'm thinking of Montreal and the original inhabitants. And you were mentioning the mountain. I mean, all sites where history played a very important part and originated with people populating it whose languages we do not know or are not being taught anymore, or we don't have the closeness to this. But yet, if you want to write about it, I thought about a German thing. I'm sorry that I bring that up again because it's the closest to my heart. Like when Sheila Fishman, for example, whom I admire, adore, with all the work she has done, even in German literature, tried to translate Christa Wolf. And I was thinking, we have spoken about things often, but if you send one of our students in the German department to Germany, to Berlin, that's where they all want to end up, and they discover the city and they go to sites, which are important sites. I just name one of the most important ones and well known. Checkpoint Charlie. Here's a checkpoint. Now, there are stories about Checkpoint Charlie because it separated East and West. mentality and mentality, political life and political life, separation, walls, and so on. Censorship, like I had to work in the Brecht archives often, and I had to cross. And then the difficulties getting a right to cross for a day and so on. So if a student has to translate a story, a short story of an East German or a West German writer into French or English for students here, for example, there is this question, the memory, the political entity of that spot, which is called Checkpoint Charlie, the history of it, the total new existence of it, it's just hidden behind a name. What do they have to learn? What, how accurate can they be? I guess it has to do with the ability of these students to catch all that. The historical aspect, the present aspect, the separation aspect, the site, the geography of that site. Do you send them on field trips?
I wish we could.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't done that yet, but I think, that's certainly possible. But that's a question of, I think, that's very much a translation question. It's about transmission of memory. So who does memory belong to through generations, but also from one group to another? To what extent can memory be shared? History we think of as documents, or they can learn about Checkpoint Charlie somewhere. There are documents, there is history that they must, but memory would be their personal relationship or the story that place tells them. So sites, I think they have their histories and they have their memories and they have the stories that they tell, and what those stories will change in the same way that we accuse translation of not being, loss and gain, and translation is always variable, and how do you trust translators? Well, how do you trust memory? How do you trust history? How do you know you're going to get the exact right, version of things? Well, I think that's something you must deal with, and you have to understand that is going to change, that changes from one group to another and from one generation to another. And you can try and stay as accurate as you can, but still there will be that subjective link to historical fact or historical place. Mm-hmm. And the thing about place that I find so interesting is that you have an emotional reaction to place. So places are, it's places when you visit a place. What attracted me to what I call my translation sites or polyglot places is the kind of emotional reaction experience that you have as an individual encountering those places, and how some places have a particular power to move you. And often that power has to do with some kind of contradiction within them. And that contradiction for me is often a contradiction of language. So for instance, when I go to Toledo, I go to visit Toledo, Spain, and I visit a synagogue, which from the 1300s on has become a church. We know the story of the Inquisition, of the expulsion of Jews from Spain, Toledo, this very cruel history of Judaism and Islam in Spain. So this place, when you visit it, it's not called a synagogue. It's known as a synagogue, but it's called Santa Maria la Blanca. There's something extremely moving and conflictual about that they can continue to use that name. It's kind of an example of the kinds of disorientation or the running up to realities together that is very affecting. So what I'm talking about is less when you were talking about Checkpoint Charlie, how do you learn about the reality or the historical reality of it? I'm interested in the historical reality, but also the way in which the individual interacts with that place, the experience that you have, and the lessons that you learn from this experience.
Yeah, yeah. I can sense that very, very much when you talked about the different places too. I've just one historical question. What about, for example, women in translation? I mean, is it still very much a men's world, or is the sensitivity of women when it comes to language now also incorporated in these studies? I mean, it has to do, of course, with gender in translation, but the history of women in the history of women in literature, period. But here in translation, especially, can you say something about it? Has that changed a bit? I guess, I hope.
Yes, it's interesting that you say, has it always been, is it still a men's world? Because in fact, translation has historically, back to at least the 17th century with the movement called Les Belles Infidèles, translation has been associated with women because, authors are men and translators are women. Like the bosses were men and the secretaries were women. Translators were kind of like secretaries or, handmaidens to the important authors. So there's always been a kind of a feminine association with translation in a very pejorative way, in a very negative way. What's been fascinating is that in the last 50 years or so, translation has been really swept in different directions by feminism. Not only the fact that women have become important translators, but women have driven a certain idea of translation. So done away with this idea of translation as an inferior activity. I think that translators have become much more respected in the last decades. There are now major prizes for translation. Translators are much better known. One of the very successful Elena Ferrante novels, because Elena Ferrante was a pseudonym and the author herself wasn't present on the public scene, her translator, Anne Goldstein, has become extremely prominent, and many other translators, Anne Carson, that is to say, poets who use translation as very much as a vehicle of thought, as a poetic vehicle, have worked to introduce a new sensibility, to understand translation as truly a creative activity. And in Canada, where translation is very much respected, as it should be, because translation is so much a part of our federal setup, at the same time, it's important, and translators have been quite effective in showing that translation is not only a service to the community, it's not only a federalist activity, but it's very much a creative activity. And there's so much more translation now happening between French and English in Quebec, so much more translation into French from English. It used to be sort of stronger in the other direction as far as literature was concerned. Now it's strong. Many things have happened in the translation world to make it a very exciting place, actually. It's become, I think, one of the more interesting areas of academic endeavor, but also in creativity as well. Lots going on.
Yeah, which brings me back to the book Translating Montreal. I mean, you are a Montrealer, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yes, and you are still probably going back on those childhood walks or reminding yourself, because they have changed too. These places
course.
have changed too. Even when I came to Montreal, which was 1964, I used to try to make the city, my city, by walking it, walking everywhere, taking the bus somewhere, getting out, just the way you have described it, because I found that's the way to get to know the architecture, the houses, the street, you meet the people, the distances, and so on. So is Montreal still for you the city where you find the most resources? I mean, you travel a lot. From the interviews I've listened to, you've been everywhere, and there seem to be favorite spots. Like now we have seen in Lviv, where your heart seems to have settled for a while because so much comes together there. But Montreal as a city with all its changes and present problems and mountains and river, and also there is one thing: when you grow up in Europe, everything is so much smaller. So you live with the rivers. And the first thing for me was, coming from Cologne, there was this huge river here, this Strom, we would call it, while in Cologne, the Rhine, for me, was one of a huge river, but it's a tiny little fleuve. Yeah, so I was wondering, is it still the treasure chest, Montreal, the city, your city, where you discover more and more new and newer things?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. Of course, it's changed. And as I said, this kind of sense of absolute difference, and also this sense of two realities, French and English, that has completely changed. That has completely exploded, have so many different realities. But there is something particular and different about Montreal. And it does remain, something, a place where someone interested in language and architecture will never get their fill, because there are always new combinations. There are the languages I'm interested in now, not that I know them, but Arabic has become so important in Montreal. Indian languages in Montreal, these remain sort of new horizons to explore within a city that has such an interesting history that gives it this backdrop. This memory of a past that was very divided, now less so, now more of a mosaic, but new languages now have to interact with that history and take on that memory. And that remains a source of fascination.
Yeah. I'm so happy that you have been able to come to us today, to speak to us. I want to thank you. I want to thank Roxana, our director of programming. I want to thank Shelley Pomerantz, who is just an enormous asset to our team. To, of course, all the staff, and to Maria Resina, who is our technical director, to guide us through the open books and the literary salon. And I don't know if you have your book there with you to show us again the translation sides. You have to, anybody who doesn't have the book yet should get it. It's absolutely fascinating. And I thank you for your work. Thank you for having been, and good luck for the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you to everyone.